So dear students, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to welcome you back after a 2-week break. Today we have an honor to host another top expert who will enrich our series of lectures, and who, together with our previous guest, Professor Roger Griffin, belongs to a group of foremost experts on European fascism, Professor Aristotle Kallis. Aristotle, greetings from Slovakia. Nice to have you on this virtual vault.
Greetings to you too from the north of Italy, albeit in lockdown as well, so no change there.
Before the lecture starts, as usual, I'm going to briefly introduce today's speaker. Aristotle Kallis is a Greek-born British historian who has taught history at several universities in the UK, University of Edinburgh, University of Bristol, Lancaster University, and since 2016 he has been a professor in modern history at the Kiel University. In his research, Aristotle Kallis focuses on history of fascism with an emphasis on its Italian and German variety. In this field, he has published a number of inspirational monographs. The first one is called Fascist Ideology, with the subtitle Territory and Expansionism in Italy and Germany. It was his first ever monograph, published in 2000, followed by Nazi Propaganda and the Second World War, published in 2007. 2 years later, he published Genocide and Fascism with subtitle The Eliminationist Drive in Fascist Europe. Then a book from 2014 called The Third Rome, The Making of the Fascist Capital, which might be very interesting to those who specialize in studying it, of relation between politics and urban space and their mutual interactions and the fascist and authoritarian regimes. Aristotle has also edited a reader simply called Fascism, published in 2003, and together with our Portuguese colleague Antonio Costa Pinto, a volume of texts focusing case by case on several political fascist and by fascism inspired regimes in interval and wartime period, named Rethinking Fascism and Dictatorship in Europe, published in 2014. What I especially appreciate about Aristotle's work is the fact that Aristotle has written so far very inspirational books in terms of insightful perception of fascism as a transnational phenomenon, and well-developed analysis of fascism trans-border distribution. This is actually a reason why I asked him to present one of his proposed lectures entitled The Mobility of Fascist Ideas and Practices, an Inter- and Transnational Perspective. Those of you who have been paying attention to recent discussions in Central Europe, in Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, but other European countries as well, might have noticed that in these still conservative milieus, many historians, political theorists, and even governments deny their country has ever been involved in international fascist network, and therefore insists on conserving some kind of Sonderweg, like the Germans say, the Sonderweg approach, kind of unique way, which according to their interpretations, the Central European nations had gone through in the era of fascism. Lecture followed, as every single lesson, by your questions. Should dispute these ideas, outline the transnational influences circulating across Europe, and explain the core features of Aristotle Kallis' theory of, as he calls it, fascist effect. So, Aristotle, virtual stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Anton. I always find introductions quite uncomfortable, so thank you. It was a very generous introduction. Like a lot of colleagues, we don't necessarily recognize ourselves when somebody is very generously introduces someone. Yes, I do specialize in really long and ugly titles, and today's lecture is no exception to this. But let me tell you one thing, because as Anton was saying, I proposed a few topics back in whenever it was, October, November, when we were discussing this, and one of them was the topic that is today's lecture. And you'll notice a word that I hadn't used very much in the past, but I'm starting using far more now, and that's the word mobility and mobilities. And I just want to say, right now I'm at the University of Padova. I'm here for 3 months, teaching as part of a program which is dedicated to mobilities, which is a sub-discipline, very little up until now, sadly, connected to history. It's more of a geographical and sociological topic. And when I first came to Padova to give a lecture, I was given this kind of brief. I mean, is there a connection between fascism and mobilities? And I thought, well, actually, not only is there one, but I have been trying to talk about mobilities in my own work without using the word. So Anton was kind enough to mention to something I've written, which kind of uses the term fascist effect. I've been talking about diffusion, an article that finally is coming out later this year. I got the proofs, is talking about the diffusion of fascism, and another ugly word that I'm going to come to in a moment. So I realized that I'm actually using mobility without using the word, using the ideas of mobility into what I'm saying. So I know I'm coming after Roger Griffin, and that is a very difficult space to fill. But I'm going to go slightly in a slightly different path, and hopefully we'll have things to talk about in many ways. So I'm going to share my screen so you can stop looking at me. So if you give me 1 second only, I am going to share my screen, and there we are. So as you can see, the word mobility is very much at the beginning of this title. And then, of course, it continues inter and transnational perspective, but it's really the first bit that leads to the second. So I'm going to talk about transnational perspectives, and I'm going to try and put that into a context in fascism studies. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about mobility and fascism. So I'm going to use quite a bit of the time. I have to keep an eye on the time because, as you can see, we have quite a bit to go through. But at least, if I am running out, am I right, Anton, that I have got a maximum of 60 minutes? Yeah, okay. Right, so let me just introduce this by just saying that we're standing at a very privileged historical vantage point. A few years ago, in 2019, we marked the 100th anniversary from the birth, the official birth of fascism. It so happened that I was at the spot on the day thinking, I'm going to tell you which spot in a minute, thinking that I would just go and have a look. Of course, I did realize the spot is the Piazza San Sepolcro in Milano. In Milan, it's a kind of small square, when on the 23rd of March, actually almost 102 years ago, a small bunch of fascists, back then they weren't even calling themselves per se, met up and Mussolini addressed them, the kind of radical startup that nobody notices. So I happened to be in Milan at the time, so I just went to the square, and of course I realized there are 500, 600 neo-fascists having a commemorative parade and something. So I basically left immediately. But you know, here's the thing. So it's a bit of a significant historical period now, distance, to talk about fascism. 100 years is a long time, and we're talking about almost 75, 80 years since the death of fascism as well. Now, the reason why I'm showing what I'm showing is not in order to promote my my co-edited book with my colleague Costandini Ordaki, not at all. It's just to tell you a very, very short story to introduce what I'm going to say with regard to fascism studies. Anton mentioned that in 2003, as a relatively young lecturer, I published a reader on fascism. Part of the reader was quite long, actually. It's about 60 pages, historiographical introduction to fascism. So that was 2003, okay? So all the important names at the time are there, but I also tried to create a kind of genealogy of fascism studies up until that point. Last year, we were creating a volume in honor of Roger Griffin with my colleague Konstantin, and we had to write an introduction. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to what I wrote 17 years ago and see what happens. And of course, the whole thing was so much has changed. And when we wrote together the introduction to this volume, we just said that it is impossible to talk about fascism studies today without mentioning that really big chapter of transnational approaches pretty much since the turn of the 21st century. So it is very important to keep in mind. One other story that I wanted to say with regard to this, and hopefully will become clear in the process of what I'm saying. Jorge Luis Borges, who's one of my favorite authors, has written a lot of things, but he wrote a short story, which is titled Pierre Menard, author of Quixote. And it's really short, it's about 6-7 pages, but let me just tell you very briefly and try to understand this concept, because it took me probably about a year to get my head around it. The story talks about a fictional author, Pierre Menard, as you can see in the image on the right, who in the 1930s wrote Quixote, Don Quixote. Now, hang on a minute. Don Quixote is a few centuries back. It was written by somebody called Cervantes, and so on and so forth. So what is this? Is this just kind of fraud? No, it isn't. Pierre Menard rewrote the original. And what he did was he copied word for word the original text. No big deal. It's called copy paste these days. Okay, nothing happens. But no, Borges tells us he did something else. He rewrote Don Quixote as if he was the first person to write it back at the time that it was written. So it's a bit difficult to get your head around it, but what this story brings up is basically, if you reproduce something, do you copy it? Or do you produce something new? And Borges' point is that even if Pierre Menard copied the original text word by word, because he wrote it in the 20th century, it was a completely different text. So keep that point in mind, because hopefully we're going to get back to it in a moment. I'm always blown away by Borges's stories, and also the way in which in many ways they relate to our lives in many ways. But anyway, so let me tell you where I'm coming from. My recent interest in fascism studies, in particular with regard to that transnational perspective and indeed to mobilities comes from frustration, what I call the bad habits. So like with every historiographical field, there are some things that we seem particularly that are particularly hard to shake off, to change, to revisit, to question. And there are a number of things that I could say with regard to this. One of them is this idea, this long-term idea that when we talk about fascism, we talk primarily about Italy and Germany. Okay, now I am talking to an audience of people who mostly, I expect, I'm sorry if I get this wrong, but I expect that you are based in Slovakia, many, most, all, I don't know, but many of you. I am originally Greek. So all our case studies have always been in the shadow of Italy and Germany. Now, there are two problems with this. The first problem is that to put together Italy and Germany is in itself problematic. As we know, there are certain scholars throughout the past who have questioned this connection, who have said that the two are not similar enough to be put under a single category. So, you know, obviously it's not a mainstream fascism studies view, but a lot of people have said that, hang on a minute, why Italy and Germany? But the second point is, fine, fascism started in Italy, in a way, politically, and fascism, if we accepted the same thing, took off in Germany. And then the two of them together plunged the continent into the war. So fine, they're quite important, we get it, fine. Are they really that special in relation to others? Another question. So we live in COVID times, and all these words come back with a vengeance. So in the 1960s, Eugene Weber, who is one of the less known but still very important scholars of generic and comparative fascism, wrote a book called Varieties of Fascism. So he was trying to make a point that, yes, Italy and Germany are important, and the two are not exactly the same, but they're all variants, haha, like COVID, variants of the same thing. And he put Romania in, and he put Hungary in, and he put Spain in, and he put all these different things. So he said, you know what? They're not exactly the same, but they're quite similar to the point that they're variations of something very important. Pretty much what Roger was talking to you 2 weeks ago, Roger Griffin. So this is the thing. So yes, okay, Italy and Germany is central, but we have to talk about this other variants. And then we have the other problem, and this is the bit that frustrated me. If you accept that Italy and Germany are central to the discussion of fascism, then you get into all sorts of problematic terms. Peripheral fascisms. Now, Slovakia is a case, is being discussed as peripheral. Greece is even more peripheral. Some people don't even bother. Failed fascisms. Not so much in Slovakia. We can have the discussion. I saw colleagues in the list of participants. They know more about this than I. But this idea of failed fascism, or not so fascist, or not quite fascist, and everything. These were the kind of barriers that I found quite frustrating in my work. Not only the fact that we accept that Italy and Germany are absolutely central, but we relegate all other cases to a peripheral, to a semi, to a quasi-fascist state, which makes them less important in that respect. So this in itself is obviously was quite problematic. And part of what I was trying to do is trying to, as it were, find ways to deal with those peripheral varieties, the variants, the mutations, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the historiography of fascism studies has spent a lot of time discussing what is fascist and what is not fascist. And I grew increasingly frustrated with this discussion. Not because it's not important. Of course, there is space to talk about what distinguishes fascism from other things. Absolutely. But my problem, and it's something that I've been working for a few years now, is that the historical reality is much more messy. Things get bundled up, things get confused. There are all sorts of movements and regimes and people who span the entire spectrum, from radical revolutionary fascists to conservative rightists. But what we see in the interwar period is that the two come very much together and talk to each other and are influenced from each other and are learning from each other. And it is this dynamic process that I find exceptionally interesting when we're talking about the history of fascism. Something that Anton mentioned as well, fascism studies spent a long time, being confined within national historiographies. So people in Greece wrote about Greek fascism. People in Italy wrote mostly about Italian fascism. Scholars in France were writing mostly about French fascism. There's nothing wrong with this, absolutely. But if we focus solely on fascism as a national phenomenon, we lose sight of all those connections, of all those circulations, of ideas traveling. And this is the central idea of what I'm trying to say. Plus, it gives us something that, again, Anton mentioned in his introduction. It gives us all this kind of fictions. Here at the bottom, you see a book in French by somebody who I'm going to mention in a moment, The Myth of the French Allergy to Fascism. There was a whole industry of historiography from the 1950s onwards that was talking about how France was immune to fascism. Different countries have got different ideas. My country of origin has got the same thing. I know that there's a bit of a sensitive discussion in Slovakia, in Croatia, in all countries. We are all in this kind of perception, confined within national lines. So we need to go beyond that. We need to be aware of the context, and we need to be aware of how the historical context beyond national borders influenced national varieties of fascism in that respect. So Roger Griffin is one of the arch genericists, believes in generic fascism, and I consider myself indebted to his work, because having people who have defined fascism so excellently means that the rest of us don't have to do it, which is really a great luxury to have these days. And the reason why I put this video here is because it's an interview that Roger gave with my colleague Konstantin 2 years ago, and he talks about the importance of generic fascism and so on and so forth. It is the work of people like Roger who made fascism intelligible, accessible, usable, understandable, beyond single case studies, because essentially Roger and others like Stanley Payne, Zev Sternel, Emilio Gentile, a lot of people that I'm not going to do justice to by not mentioning them here. What they try to do is try to identify what is similar and important enough in fascism, but at the same time create models that allow us to compare, to go a little bit beyond, and so on. So in that respect, this is important. There are people who are distinctly unhappy, of course, with generic fascism. They think that the generic fascism is problematic. It doesn't make sense. It's too basic. People from Gilbert Allardyce in the 1970s, who wrote an article saying what fascism is not, so he had enough, to Michel Daubry, who is the author of that book that I showed you about L'Allergie Française, very interesting scholar who basically says I don't care what fascism is as an ideology. I care about how that thing that we may call fascism developed in the interwar years in interaction with other phenomena. So this is one of the critiques to generic fascism per se. And here's where all these comparative and transnational studies come into discussion. Apologies for the water sound every now and then. A comparative approach, I started as a comparativist, and I was comparing the central cases, Italy and Germany. So you know what, not very much of an innovation there. By comparison allows you to engage both in similarities and differences. So similarities are important. Differences are also important because they make you ask, why is this case study different? Why is religion so important in Slovakia and Croatia, but it's not in Italy? It's not in Britain, and so on and so forth. Why is violence important in case study A or B, anti-Semitism in case study A or B? So this kind of comparison sharpens our understanding. But it is that more recent development of transnationalism that actually adds a different dimension. It adds dimension that has to do with the processes of fascism, how ideas traveled, how people traveled, how by traveling they influence each other, how by influencing each other ideas changed over time, how ideas clashed, how ideas interacted, how ideas got synthesized. That was a dynamic process. Part of the problem that historians have sometimes is that we take the past as a given. So we know what fascism was because we're looking at it from the point of view of 2021 and so on and so forth. But what if we were doing something similar to what Borges did in that story? Try to understand and write about fascism as if we were in that context, as if we didn't know what was happening, as if we didn't know the outcome, but we were interested in the process of change that shaped that thing that we call fascism. So here's where all this interest in movement comes in. Now, historians of fascism are not necessarily very aware of this body of literature, but there is a literature, mostly in political science, I would say, that talk about waves of fascism, that talk about diffusion of fascism. And essentially what they do is they're trying to say how what was happening in Italy or in Germany, or indeed any other country in the 1920s and 1930s influenced other countries, other regimes, other parties, other movements in interwar Europe at the time, and made them learn, reject, accept, change, all these things. So I'm using one example here, Kurt Wayland, very interesting stuff on the history of that kind of diffusion of fascism in the interwar years. So diffusion and fascism have already been connected, but not necessarily in historical studies per se. So I'm here to make a case for the importance of that dynamic approach to fascism, the approach to fascism that accepts that yes, fascism was an ideology, and yes, fascism had concrete political experiences, regimes, manifestations like parties, regimes, and so on and so forth. But we also, and it's a case of also, it's not a case of instead, we also need to examine the processes through which all these movements, parties, regimes in different countries over a period of time changed, learned from each other, interacted with each other, clashed with each other, and so on. That's why I'm making the case for a dynamic approach, historical approach to fascism, and to fascism studies and to fascism. And here is where my starting point is for that. Given that we talk again and again, those of us who believe that fascism was a generic phenomenon, it kind of spread. We talk about spreading, and we all know very well now what this word means because we learned it very well with the pandemic. But when something spreads, means something travels. It crosses those national boundaries that we're talking about. So fascism in country A could not have developed purely in fascist A, could not have developed because something was happening in country B and people in country A learned from it. It's all about the processes. How did they learn about it? How did they react to it? And so on and so forth. And it is this process of dynamic exchange that help us understand why we have so many variations, so many variants, if you like, and mutations, to be even more flippant about this, of fascism in different countries at the time. And this is where mobilities cross my life consciously. Because I have been dealing with this, I've been grappling with this, I've been trying to understand this dynamic, mobile aspect in the history of fascism. And I was not aware that there is a very interesting literature in other disciplines, in geography, partly in history, but not so much fascism studies, in sociology, as I said, in political science, in anthropology, and so on and so forth, that it's dealing with this phenomenon of mobilities. And essentially, what mobilities does is it draws attention to communication. So ideas do not travel because they travel. We have to question this. Why do ideas travel? When we say that fascism spread, what do we mean? Why did fascism spread? In 1919, fascism was a loser. Nobody knew about them. Nobody cared about them. So how come, and this new political force becomes successful? It becomes, again, I'm being flippant, it becomes viral, it becomes successful, and then it starts spreading. Okay, so mobilities draws attention to communications across space, over time, and draws our attention to how ideas travel, how people travel, and with them ideas, how books travel. One of the very interesting works was the history of reception of Mein Kampf. The book is published in Germany, but then it travels, it gets translated, it's being read by other people, it's being read by people in different contexts. This is very interesting, this is very important. So mobilities, in my opinion, creates a new perspective in the study of fascism. It draws attention to how fascism spread, into inverted commas, through people, through artifacts like books, through ideas. And it is that is the most difficult thing. How do ideas travel? Why do ideas become successful or not? Why at that particular point? Why in some countries more than in others? Why do they change in that process? I use the example of religion. Well, fascism in Italy in the 1920s had very little interest in religion. And yet, disciplines of fascism in other countries who looked at what fascism was doing in Italy and tried to, into inverted commas, imitate, in different countries, such as Romania, for example, they combined that external influence with something that was very important to the national identity of that country. And in Romania, those people believed that the Romanian nation is defined by religion, by Christianity. So they put it together. So ideas do not simply travel, do not simply spread. They have effects. They change as they travel. And this is part of what we are discussing. Now, of course, you need triggers. You need important events. And here, yes, of course, the centrality of Italy and Germany Absolutely. I mean, had it not been for the March on Rome, had it not been for the successful, as it turned out, takeover of power by Mussolini in October 1922, maybe fascism, and it's just a maybe fascism would have been confined to the footnote of a historical book from the interwar period. This was when fascism made it. This is the point where fascism attracted attention. Something that was almost entirely unknown in 1919 as a political movement. Its figurehead is coming to power in 1922. And we know it was successful. We know it was very important because a number of people were instantly influenced by it. So immediately when the news of Mussolini's appointment as prime minister traveled from Italy to other countries, people reacted to them immediately. So you have here Hitler back then leading another losing political sect with very few adherents, enthusiastic, but very few. And now he's being called in Munich press as the Bavarian Mussolini. He is very much influenced by this. He says, we're going to do something similar in a few years. And then, of course, you have Corneliu Zelia Codreanu, who is then a young student, but he says that he wrote afterward that he remembers the day that he learned that Mussolini was appointed prime minister of Italy. And to him, that was almost like an omen that something is changing. Okay, so you can see that already. And then, of course, you have this character here, about whom I'm going to talk in a moment more, but let me just briefly tell you, this is Miguel Primo de Rivera. Who is who exactly? He's a dictator in Spain, taking over power in 1923, a military, conservative, Catholic, really very unlike other fascists, as it were. He comes from a very conservative background, but he is fascinated by Mussolini and he wants to do similar things. And he's the first prime minister, along with the King of Spain, who visited Italy with Mussolini as prime minister. And he wants to be called the Spanish Mussolini. And he talks about Mussolini as if it's his inspiration, and so on. So what's happening in Italy in 1922 proves very influential. Fast forward 11 years, 1933 is a different kind of trigger. If 1922 could be seen as an Italian thing, when another radical startup takes power, well, Hitler's, the figurehead of that radical startup takes power in Germany, then it's no longer just an Italian thing. It's something that has the potential to become an international force. It's spreading. If you read newspapers in 1933, published just after Hitler is coming to power, you will see how the language is talking about the spreading of fascism, spreading of what happened in Italy. It's moving into other countries. And of course, what happens after 1933, quite a lot of things are happening. But you know, ideas do not simply travel. Ideas influence people. So let's talk about who are the agents who carry ideas, who transmit ideas, who change ideas. Well, we have different kinds of people here. We have a few people who were attracted to fascism at the very beginning because they were fascinated by it. And, you know, we talk about fascist movements and fascist fighters in different countries that start in the 1920s and then they become more fanatical in the 1930s and more diffuse and so on. Yeah, this is one group. But we have another very important group here. These are not your standard fascists who dress in uniforms and join the parties and sing songs and so on and so forth. These are more critical people, people who are not going to join necessarily a political party, but they're influenced by what's happening. They're influenced by what they're saying. They study what they're saying. They pick up things that they like. Maybe they pick up things that they find interesting, and then they reject things that they don't like. That's why I call them critical. They're critical observers. They're people who are interacting with this, who are learning from it, but they are actually quite selective. And this is how fascism, into inverted commas, spread much broader than you would expect, not only to the enthusiastic adherents, those who were attracted to fascism as if it was some kind of omen, like Odreanu was saying, but there were also a large number of other people who maybe didn't agree 100% with fascism, not at all, and certainly they weren't revolutionaries, but they thought there are interesting ideas here. We can learn from this, we can adapt this, we can make it very, very different. So immediately ideas travel, but they travel through networks, through people, through organizations, through newspapers, through publications, and they create networks of interaction one way or another. Some of those networks are encouraged by the fascist regimes themselves. Here is an example. Mussolini in 1933 launched this action committees for the universality of Rome. He even held a congress in Switzerland at the peak, 1933. And the idea was to bring together all the, into inverted commas, fascist forces in Europe into a forum to discuss. Of course, they don't call it fascist because back then the word fascism meant mostly Italian, not the way we're using it today, but, you know, almost like they're talking about this. They're talking about Italy as the center of this new political faith and all those satellites orbiting Rome. They don't say fascism, they say Rome. But you can see here an example of a fascist movement and a regime itself trying to internationalize, to go beyond its own boundaries. Then you have people. People are interested and they travel. Here's Oswald Mosley travels to Rome at a very critical period in his life. He had, in 1932-33, he was disaffected. He had become impatient with parliamentary democracy. He travels to Italy, he meets Mussolini, he talks about having some kind of conversion. He goes back, he creates the British Union of Fascists. And here is our other character that I was saying earlier on, Miguel Primo de Rivera. He visits Rome in 1923. It is a tribute. He comes to see Mussolini because he acknowledges Mussolini as a source of inspiration, as the main source of inspiration. Primo de Rivera does not want to create a fascist party. He doesn't want to dress in a paramilitary uniform. For him, fascism is a new force from which he can learn. So he goes back to Spain and he starts introducing youth organizations. He's learning from fascism as it unfolds at the time in Italy. Remember, that's 1923. If only we could, and it's impossible, transport ourselves back to 1923, we would know nothing about fascism. We would know nothing. Very little had been written about fascism. Very little had Mussolini done or said about fascism. So it's how people look at it and how people understand it and choose to learn from it that matters here. Less so what the fascists themselves thought. And then, of course, ideas travel. And sometimes they catch, and sometimes they don't catch. There are a few countries that in the interwar period where fascism did not really have an appreciable impact. We can talk about which countries these were, and there are different interpretations of it. But I mean, you could say that in some countries, for example, fascism didn't catch. In other countries, fascism became very popular in many ways. So ideas do not simply travel. There are reasons why they travel. There are boundaries that are being crossed. There are people on either side who interact with those ideas. And as ideas, into inverted commas, travel and interact, they change. Because the new actor in another country looks at what's happening in Italy and then adds something to it, interprets it in a particular way. They're looking at what's happening in Italy, but they live in another country and they want to say, yeah, okay, that's a good idea, but we can't do this in our country. We have to add this element, or we have to change this element, because essentially what they too want to do is they want to sell themselves and their party in their new countries. So they're changing, they're rewriting fascism in many ways. They're not just copying what is happening in Italy or Germany. And I said at the beginning, my interest in this whole discussion comes from a frustration, because when I was growing up as a scholar of fascism, growing up is not the right word, there was a lot of talk about, you have this kind of proper fascists in the middle, and then you have all those imitators, people who were looking what's happening in Italy and they were imitating. No, these are not passive imitators. They're learning from what's happening elsewhere. And in the process of learning, they become translators. They're not imitators. They're not parroting what's happening in Italy and what's happening in Germany. Yes, they borrow the uniforms. Yes, they borrow the symbols. We'll see that in a moment, one way or another. But they adapt them. They translate them. They change them. They enrich them. And this is what, to me, is absolutely fascinating. So imitation, oh yes, of course, yes, they adopt the fascist salute. Yes, they may be adopting the fascist salute. The fascist salute was adopted by the Greek fascists in the 1930s, but they didn't call it fascist salute. Of course not. They were calling it something that related to Greek history. And that's what's happening in every country. So this is the important thing I want to say. It's something that I would like you to keep in mind. As fascism gets diffused in the 1920s, and particularly in the 1930s, it doesn't simply get diffused like a virus. There are people who are interested in what's happening in other countries, not only in Italy, not only in Germany. Their attention shifts from what's happening in one country to the other. They're exposed to what's happening. They learn. News travel very fast. There's newspapers, there's newsreel, they see, they get influenced. But then, because they want to sell themselves in their own countries, they don't just copy, they select bits they like. They reject maybe some other bits that they don't like. They translate, they make them work for them, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. So this is the main problem they have. How to prove that they're part of this new ideological and political force without being imitators. Here is a character. You can spend a lot of time to read this, but don't. It's okay. I mean, I appreciate we've got about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes left. So I'd rather just say, here is José Antonio Primo de Rivera, the son of Miguel Primo de Rivera that we saw earlier, who visited Mussolini in 1923, and the founder of a fascist movement in Spain, the fascist Falange. Here he is talking in 1933. And look what he's saying. He's responding to criticism. He says, they say we're imitators. They say we're imitators because our movement, this movement, which is bringing a sea change back towards the genuine court of Spain, is one which has come about in other places. Italy, Germany have turned towards themselves and everything. And then he says, to my comrade, I would say, do not worry too much. We do not imitate. Our movement is rooted in Spain. Let us tell them that we are imitating the fascists, because what we do is we are rediscovering our national tradition, the Castilian things, part of our tradition. When his father, Primo de Rivera, Miguel Primo de Rivera, was asked if he's simply copying Mussolini, he said, no, I'm not. my movement is based in Spanish traditions, the paramilitary organizations of the Soma 10. Anybody who's working in Spanish history will probably know that. So here's the thing, how to find that balance between saying, I am with you, Italy and Germany and other countries, but what I believe and what I say, I am not copying you. I am doing my own thing. I am doing a version of Spanish or French or Slovak or Italian or Greek or whatever nationalism in many ways. So what do? I'm going to spend a couple of minutes explaining these two terms. You have an idea that you like somewhere else. You see what Mussolini is doing with regard to youth organization. Or you know what? You like the logo. It's really nice. The fascist logo in Italy, it looks really nice. Or the Nazi logo in Nazi Germany or whatever. And you say, right, I'm going to use something like this. I'm going to use a logo, but what I'm going to do is I'm not going to copy it, because then everybody will say I'm imitating them. So I'm going to do something slightly different. And what am I doing here is I am basically saying that logo expresses my national history. So I frame the idea from somewhere else to be like my own country. And then I'm doing something else. I am adding it to what is already being said in my own country. So by doing that, I am not simply copying. I am owning the idea. I'm making it mine. And then I can say, this is what I believe. Yes, I'm behind Mussolini and Hitler and so on and so forth. But what I'm saying is rooted in the traditions of my own country. And in the process, the idea has changed, because guess what? In some countries, fascism had become religious. In other countries, fascism had become anti-Semitic. In others, it has not. And so on and so forth. So all these things. And the name is interesting in this discussion, because in some organizations, you'll see here a French group called Le Faisceau. The word and the symbol is almost similar to Italian fascism. So here is somebody who doesn't want to hide it. But if you look at the names of the movements back then, very few actually used the term fascism. Mostly did in Britain, fascist revolution. In fact, the British liked the term, even the first movement, British fascisti, they were called in the 1920s, and very few people know about them because they weren't successful, but they used the term. But look at what happened in Spain. This is the Falange. And in its first publication, it was using this FE. Now, fine, you could say Falange Española. So this is the originals of the abbreviation, the acronym of the movement. But the F also stands for fascismo. And this kind of ambiguity was cultivated by the Spanish fascists. They wanted people to think, okay, it's not just Falange Español, but it's fascismo español. So you don't want to say it, because if you say it too much, then you are being accused of copying, but you want to say, you want to kind of let it linger in some cases. So the name is important. And then, of course, you have ideological translations. So forget about the symbols, forget about the words, forget about the names and so on and so forth. Here is Codreanu in Romania. And look at what she's saying. Italy has as many Jews as Romania has Chiangai and indigenous people and so on. An Italian anti-Semitic movement would be as if Romanians started a movement against the Shanghai. Here, Codreanu is responding to a comment made to him that, how can you say you're related to what's happening in Italy when you are anti-Semitic and fascism in Italy is not anti-Semitic? And he says, in Romania, fascism could only mean the removal of the Jewish threat and the clearing of the path to the survival and glory to which Romanians are entitled. So essentially, he says, in every country, this radical new creed that we're all part of expresses itself in many different ways, and expresses itself in ways that relate to the country. So in Romania, because Jews were seen as a threat, because Romanian nationalism had this kind of layer of anti-Semitism that was very, very strong. Romanian fascism would, of course, be anti-Semitic in the way that Italian fascism wouldn't. There's a very long quote here that I'm not going to get into a discussion, but let me tell you, here's Mosley. And Mosley wrote quite a long book, but in it he says not only that I'm quite proud to use the term fascism, but he also says that, yes, we can be all fascist while being very different in country to country. We can be fascist, we can identify with what's happening in other countries while still being faithful to our tradition and our nation and our national history and so on and so forth. He says, hang on a minute, is every liberal in every country the same? Do they say the same things? Do they speak the same things? Do they write the same things? No, because liberalism, and like every other ideology, he talks about socialism, changes a bit from country to country. The same, he says, about fascism. So look what Mosley is doing here. He's saying, I am saying it loud and proud. I am a fascist. I am part of the worldwide fascist revolution. But no, my fascism is also homegrown. It's not something imported. It's not something that I imitate. It's something that I have co-produced. I have become a producer of the ideology because I learned and I changed in the process. So you have all these ideological translations, which are very important. Think of something else. Anti-Semitism. Nazi Germany passes the Nuremberg laws, and what's happening within a very short period of time? A number of countries, not all of them, not all the countries in Europe, not even fascist movements across Europe, not all of them picked up what happened in Germany, but some of them start introducing legislation that copies, but goes beyond. Hungary, Romania, I would say even Slovakia, albeit in the middle of the Second World War. But let us talk about Hungary and Romania. Religion is very important in those definitions of the laws in this country. Yes, you have biological racism and anti-Semitism, which is clearly influenced by Nazi Germany, but you have all these new dimensions which you cannot see in Nazi Germany, but you see in Hungary and particularly in Romania, where religion, i.e. whether a Jew is religious or not, becomes a major criterion. When whether a Jew has been born in Romanian soil or not becomes a major criterion. And then you have, of course, Ustasha in Croatia. And yes, you have anti-Semitism. And yes, the Croat Ustasha comes to power in 1941 in the middle of the Second World War, obviously. And in the words of Jonathan Steinberg, one English-speaking historian of the movement, they passed so much of the fascist legislation that took years to Germany to pass. They passed it in the course of 3 months. Okay, but what do? They own the idea. Yes, they persecute the Jews. Yes, the setup comes for the Jews, but they also persecute the Roma, and they also persecute the Serbs. And it goes on like this. So you can see here how ideas travel, but they also get changed in the process, and how those fascist agents in different countries do not only copy those ideas, but they change them, they rewrite them, they enrich them, they take them in different directions. And in so doing, they are rewriting the history of fascism in many ways. And let me tell you my final example with regard to this. Okay, so an idea travels. Somebody like Salazar, the Prime Minister of Portugal, not a fascist, not someone who ever used the term, absolutely not, an economics professor, a conservative by personality type, a technocrat, an academic, becomes Prime Minister of Portugal, and he starts introducing a number of political innovations that he's clearly influenced by what's happening in Italy, and back then in Italy mostly, not so much Germany, but Italy. I tell you one, corporatism. This is the time when Italy has introduced corporatism in the 1927, 1928, and it is seen as the major contribution. Corporatism is a model of organization of society and an alternative to the parliamentary system. And Salazar builds Portugal as a corporatist state and publishes a constitution. So here you can say one thing, you can say that Salazar is learning from what's happening in Italy, but he is also copying this in a way that goes beyond the original idea. He's adding things to it. He's making it, he developed a very elaborate constitution. He married it with Catholicism as part of the everyday practice in Portugal. So you could say, yes, the idea traveled and changed, and Salazar wrote something, and Salazar changed it and enriched it. So the idea in Salazar is different. That's one thing, but there's something else. Salazar's Portugal becomes one of the most influential models of authoritarian fascist-like dictatorship in the 1930s. The Greek fascist regime, led by another general, talking about non-fascist, Metaxas, sees Portugal as the best example for Greece. He says, I'm fascinated by the regimes in Italy and Germany, but if I want to learn from something, that will be Portugal. So not only is the original idea traveling and changing, so Salazar becomes the author of the new idea, but then he travels further and it influences other people and it goes further and further and further. So it's all about this dynamic process where ideas circulate, and in the process, yes, we may call it like this, mutate one way or another. So I'm going to go to the conclusions because I'm aware that the time is short. And I'm going to just show you a few sort of final points, but let me first share with you a quote, and I want to spend a couple of minutes on that quote. Here is General Antonescu in Romania. Let me just make the quote disappear so that we can read it together. Let me tell you a few things about him. Antonescu, a general, leader of a fascist movement? No. Particularly interested in fascist ideology? Well, not really up until 1939, you could say one way or another. He comes to power in 1939, and the first thing he does, one of the first things he does, is he brings the Romanian fascists into a coalition with them. So he sees which way the wind is blowing. Germany is seemingly invincible at the time. Fascism seems to be taking over the world. Liberal democracy seems to be pretty much dead. So he declares himself, he creates a new state with the Iron Guard. That state doesn't go very well. It gets suppressed after a few months. So essentially he turns against those fascist collaborators, as it were, and then he rules by himself. Okay, so here's somebody who comes from a background that it's not particularly fascist, but he's learning from what's happening in other countries. He's interested in what's happening in other countries. He aligns himself with Nazi Germany. That's why he's wearing all those military insignia. Look what he says. I'll let you read it for a second, and then you can just pick up a few things. I could not find a better quote to encapsulate what I've been trying to say. So here's somebody who says, essentially, he doesn't say that, but essentially, I'm a Romanian nationalist. I'm not a fascist. I don't consider myself fascist. My life is my national interest. But I recognize myself as part of this new radical political force called fascism, led by German National Socialism and fascist, i.e. Italian fascist achievements. So I'm learning from them, and I'm part of that crusade. But I'm not copying them, because what do? I am adapting what they're doing to the Romanian needs in order to graft these ideas onto our realities. There you go. So, should we be talking about failed fascism? Because somehow what these and other people in different countries did not exactly match what Italy or Germany did. No, there's no such thing as failed fascism. There's less revolutionary fascism. There is something that comes close to fascism. There is religious fascism, clerical fascism, and so on and so forth. There is fascism that didn't take off in terms of appealing to the masses, but not fascism that did not really make it or was simply an imitation, and so on and so forth. Is it only an Italian and central thing? No. Is it something that is mostly an Italian and certain thing? Well, you could say that it starts from there, but no. Fascism becomes a pan-European, transnational ideological and political force. It's a set of ideas, they travel and they get changed in the process, and local agents add to the text. They don't simply imitate, they don't simply reproduce. They select, they read, they translate, they add, they change. Okay. This mobility of ideas and how it happens, it doesn't just happen, is crucial to the understanding of the power of fascism in the interwar years, and particularly the 1930s. And this kind of approach, focusing on diffusion, is a welcome extension of that new transnational approach to fascism. So yes, we accept that fascism crossed borders. Yes, we accept fascism traveled, but we have to understand the processes. We have to understand why it caught on in some areas and not in others. And our models of fascism must accommodate the fact that in different countries, fascism had to be different. So Croat fascism had to be different and very different. The Greek fascism or the Slovak fascism or the Portuguese fascism had to be different from the alleged sources of inspiration. That doesn't make them less fascist or not. This is the important thing. So I hope my original point about that copy of Don Quixote, which was word by word, but not really, it was imitation, but not really, makes a little bit more sense. Like Pierre Menard, who rewrote Don Quixote after 300 years, he's producing something new because he was revisiting something else from his own experience, from his country's own experience. I am going to stop at this point, literally just under an hour, and I'm going to thank you very much for your attention.
So Aristotle, thank you very much for your lecture. Can you see me on camera or not? Do you see me? Okay.
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay. It was a very inspirational lecture. I put down almost 2 pages of notes and questions, but first we're going to give a space to our colleagues and students to ask. So Jakub Drabik raised his hand first, as I expected.
Hi there, hi Aristotle. Thank you for a great talk, very inspirational. I always enjoy your lectures, and this one was no different. I have this question that I keep thinking, and I'm trying to formulate in my head, and I'm not sure if it's going well. But okay, do you see any significant differences in the way how fascism ideas spread in the world in comparison to other ideologies? I mean, was it different in some techniques or some patterns how it spread? And I keep thinking about comparison, especially with the other revolutionary ideology of the 20th century, communism, because the national permutations of fascism are very different from each other, are very diverse, but national permutation of communism are not that different. And is it because of the nature of fascism and communism? The one is nationalistic, the other international, or is it also because of the way how the ideas spread? Do you see any like significant differences?
Thank you, Jakub. I saw you at the beginning, but then I forgot I'm talking to experts in many different ways. We're all experts in what we're doing. So there you go. It's a very interesting question because, of course, ideas spread, any ideas, political ideas, any kind of ideas spread in not necessarily two dissimilar ways, but in modern times, let's put it this way. I mean, you know, it's not the word of mouth that it was some centuries ago or whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody has to travel from space to space to spin the idea. So in the 20th century, another radical ideology like socialism, you could say that it's spreading in a not dissimilar way. Now, of course, there are fundamental differences. First of all, fascism is an almost complete unknown in the 1920s. And that is actually a blessing for the fascists because everybody can read and project onto it whatever they like. Mm. While socialism, of course, has canonical texts. In the 1920s, there is a political center in many ways. Okay, Italy and Germany become political centers in the process, but there is no such thing as a canonical doctrine. In fact, the fascists go out of the way to say, in that quote by Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera that I was reading, he goes out of his way to say, you know, who gained anything from doctrines? You know, what do we say about this? But I would say the big difference here is that not only is fascism quite sexy, as it's seen at the time. I mean, you know, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying anything weird in that respect, but it's new, it's radical, it's quite powerful to see. Don't forget, news travel in that way as well. Back then, you see images, you see newsreel maybe. But what also happens is because it's a relative unknown, but it's a nationalist force, so it already, the door is half open, you know, you're anti-communist, you're nationalist, that's pretty mainstream, you know, you're maybe anti-Semitic later on for National Socialism and so on and so forth, but you don't know very much about this movement, and essentially you are projecting your wishful thinking. So fascism can mean so many different things to different people, and in that respect, yes, you have more eager learners. So in that respect, it travels differently, I would say. So it catches on in unpredictable ways. And I always use Miguel Primo de Rivera as an example because in 1923, he comes from a completely different background. He has no interest in the revolutionary stuff of fascism, and yet he becomes somebody who clearly identifies Mussolini as his source of inspiration, but he does his own thing as well. He picks up, he learns, he rejects what he doesn't like, he does his own thing. So all this makes it much easier to communicate. I don't know whether you said you didn't formulate the question. I don't know whether I formulated the answer, but
okay. Thank you. It was fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. Time for the others to ask, to use this opportunity. Adam Gajdoš is next.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your lecture. It was great. I would like to ask you if during your study, have you identified any of the characteristics that made fascism so appealing to the other nations? Was it the fact that it was new, that it was something different from sort of liberalism or socialism, or what were the core aspects that attracted the other nations to the cause?
Very good question. Thank you very much, Adam. It's probably not only one thing. You already said a couple of things that are very important. Fascism had the aura of the new, and that's very important at a time where, again, let us try and be Pierre Menard, you know, try and go back in time and understand what it must have felt like, okay? We're talking about just after the First World War. We're talking about just after the Bolshevik Revolution. We're talking about this paranoia, this anxiety in Europe about the possibility of a communist takeover, okay? We're talking about economic dislocations. We're talking about new countries appearing on the map and feeling a bit insecure because, you know, how can you not be insecure if you are Poland, for example, and you are, you know, you have Germany on the one side and the Soviet Union on the other, and so on and so forth. And that applies to all countries. So you fear all these things. At the same time, you look at liberal democracy, and liberal democracy comes natural to some countries, but not to others. And back then, liberal democracy is not anywhere like what it is today, where, you know, a lot of people criticize it and so on and so forth, but more or less the majority of people say, you know what, it's okay, it's the better thing we've got, we'll stick to it, whatever. Back then, for a lot of countries and for a lot of people, liberal democracy was a little bit of an experiment. And people were not particularly happy with it. They, you know, all this kind of allegations about being inefficient, divisive, and so on and so forth. So you have nationalism, fear of communism and socialism. You don't particularly like liberal democracy. You see it as something alien, something that's coming from outside. And then you have something radical, nationalist. As I said, kind of jokingly, so a little bit sexy, loud, passionate, very different, very modern in many ways. And it pushes that open door of nationalism. And in that respect, you asked about the core elements of fascism. It's both the ideology, the kind of placing the nation at the heart of political action, saying that I love my community so much that this gives me the license to be violent against those I consider to be enemies. So going from nationalism to exclusive nationalism to violent nationalism and so on and so forth, these are all very important. But at the same time, it's not just the ideas, it's the emotional sides of fascism. So you see Mussolini. I mean, you know, even today we laugh when we see Mussolini, but it's a weird thing. You look at a video clip of Hitler, if you do. No, you know, most people don't, thankfully, but you know, that sort of thing. And you think, you know, my God, it's weird and it's really off-putting because you know what happened, but it's different. It's strange. So you can imagine at the time that looked like something out of the ordinary, and that immediately makes it, in the context of everything else, the fears, the anxieties, the search for something new. Here comes a third way. This is something that I didn't talk at all in my lecture, but fascism wants to present itself as a third way. Neither liberalism nor socialism. Here is the nationalist alternative. So absolutely, in that respect, it is more appealing for a number of different reasons, though.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam, for a question. Other questions? If you're too shy to ask, I'll use the opportunity to ask a question. Aristotle, I actually like very much what you said about the triggers. Actually, my question is, you are talking all the lecture about historical fascisms in the fascist era, but recently, in the last decades, we've been observing a significant rise of European far-right and neo-fascist movements. So my question is, what events or what set of events do you consider trigger of neo-fascism or far-right?
Oh, yeah. You make, first of all, a very good point about something, Anton, and then I'll answer it. The broader point is that a lot of the discussion that I was trying to present with regard to historic fascism applies to obviously not exactly the same way, but in not too different ways, to a number of radical ideologies since, including contemporary phenomena about, for example, the spread of populism. You know, every 5 years when there is European Parliament elections, everybody's saying, oh, let's see how the far right is going to do now. Let's see how the populists are going to do now. Oh, it's spreading, and so on and so forth. So all this discussion is not radically different to what is happening today with regard to a number of those ideas. In the more contemporary setting, obviously the rise of the radical right or the far right, neo-fascism is somewhat different because it clearly identifies the interwar experience as the direct point of inspiration, but the broader family of the far right and everything, and the populists as well involved, it's not a major trigger per se, but you have a number of small triggers that feed into that kind of narrative. For example, just to put a few of those things, we talk about the economic crisis, and the economic crisis is a major trigger in many ways because it creates that kind of mentality, which is, I keep talking about this to my students all the time. The world is not a zero-sum game. What do we mean by the zero sum? That a country has got 10, and if we have 10 as Greeks, and then 2 more people from other countries come and stay in our country, then they'll take 2, and that means we're going to go back to 8. And somehow, everything is about this kind of zero-sum game. So the economic crisis, when suddenly everything becomes more scarce, becomes more difficult, kind of makes people think even more about this kind of mindset, which is sort of, no, I don't want immigrants. Oh, no, I don't want these people around me. Or, these people are kind of drawing resources and so on and so forth. So the economic crisis, which doesn't seem to be a one-off, it keeps going on and on and on, is definitely there. Then you have things like migration movements. This is not something that started in the last 2 decades, far from it, but it certainly has got its peaks and troughs every now and then. And that, of course, feeds into this kind of narrative. I would say things like international terrorism, for example, which always becomes a trigger. But the triggers here are indirect, because essentially what they do is they provide an excuse to those arguments to become articulated and to become more successful. So, of course, far-right parties have always been around, populist parties and forces have always been around, but the question is, why are they becoming more effective? Why are they reaching more and more people? And not only in electoral terms, not only how many people are voting for the parties, that's one indicator, but because somebody does not vote for a populist party, but actually speaks against immigrants, that's no good for me. I don't care if they didn't vote for that party. Okay, no, I do care a bit because that party is not going to end up in government. But if they have those views, if they hate immigrants, if they go around to their family, to their children and say immigrants are destroying our country and so on and so forth, then the far right ideas have actually spread in society, have come into the mainstream of society. So all these different triggers, what they do is they make the message easier to accept, to communicate and to accept. And I'm sure we can talk about a lot of different factors and triggers in every country. Don't forget something else. Something that happens in one country has an effect on other countries as well. So 2016, in hindsight, is quite a turning point in that respect. We talk about Brexit, we talk about the election of Donald Trump and so on and so forth. Immediately afterwards, there was this kind of idea that somehow you have all these new political leaders who talk the same way, who try to imitate, who don't imitate Trump. Nobody wanted to be like Trump, but they pick out things and they own them and they make them into different ways. So I think there are many different triggers, but the important thing is to understand that the trigger is not going to do it. The idea is not going to catch unless there is a level of acceptance of some core themes. So a society is not going to fight with Nazi Germany in the 1930s against the Jews unless anti-Semitism is already embedded one way or another in the structures of that society and everything. So the triggers do exactly this. They do not cause the ideas to spread, they just make people a little bit more receptive or far more receptive in that respect.
Thank you very much. Alžbeta Kúpalová is next.
Thank you for the word. First of all, let me thank you, Professor, for joining us today and for your lecture.
My pleasure.
You have partly answered this, I guess, my question, but I would like to ask it anyway. My question is related more to the current situation related to pandemic, as we constantly hear or read in the news of the hate speech or physical aggression and many examples of racial target violence against Asians, mainly in America. So my question is, do you see in these expressions of hate any aspects of fascism or not really? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alžbeta. It's a very interesting question. Is it enough if someone is openly racist to be fascist? No. In fact, if Roger was attending, and I don't think he is, he would say that he very famously said in his book, The Nature of Fascism, he said, fascism is racist, but not anti-Semitic. So it's much bigger. Racism is something much bigger. But let me tell you where I think you are right, that as in there is a connection. I think the demonization of the other, okay? So it's not just that you don't like the other, it's somehow you're turning your full attention against the other, you're blaming the other for everything that is wrong with you. It was now, in the pandemic, it's people from Asia or who look Asian into inverted commas and so on and so forth. Earlier on, it was Muslims or people who looked Muslims, and then you had the Jews who looked Jews, who dressed in a particular way, and so on and so forth. I can see a connection there, but what kind of connection is this? It's a connection. So fascism contains this mindset, which is precisely that because we love our community so much, and we only care about this narrow national community, which we define in the way that we like. So born in the country, speak the language, look in a particular way, either parents or grandparents or whatever, have a particular religion, okay? So because they say we love our country and our nation, okay, then they look at everybody else with suspicion. And when something happens that threatens that community of the nation, it's very easy for them to go to the other extreme, to say, you are the enemy, I have to fight against you. So fascism is part of that broader family of ideas, which we have to call, for want of a better word, hyper-nationalism. So it's not just nationalism, although there's no such thing as just nationalism. It's that extreme version of nationalism that predicates that the love of one's country is so extreme that everybody else is potentially treated as a potential enemy. And when something like COVID happens, which you associate with China, and you have your political leader talking about the Chinese virus and so on and so forth, then you turn against those people. So you say that in order to protect my own group, I am going to turn against the Chinese people. Okay, so in that respect, in itself, it's not an indication of fascism, but I would say they are emotionally and in some respects ideologically related through that broader category of nationalism. Can I say one more thing? I'm sorry, Anton, but I think it's such an interesting question, Alberta. There is somebody, and I don't know whether you have talked about him at all in your course. He's not a fascist scholar, okay? It's Umberto Eco. You may have heard about him one way or another, maybe somebody spoke about him, but he wrote this article calling it Or Fascism. And I'm sorry if other people have actually spoken about this and I'm not aware of it, but he wrote an article and you can find it online actually. Or means primary, as in history, something that is always there, okay? So he talks about, forget about interwar fascism, that was only a historical chapter. For him, fascism was something permanent, eternal. And he said, fascism does not need to wear uniforms, fascism does not need to have weird symbols and leather boots and blah, 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 blah. Fascism has always been around, and he tries to come up with a list of ideological characteristics that do not have to do only with the interwar period, they're permanent, okay? And one of those characteristics is the scapegoating, as we say, of the other, the fear of the other, the hatred towards the other, the fact that the hatred against the other is absolutely central to the definitions of one's identity. So if he was here, sadly he's dead, he would have answered this question and said that absolutely they are connected, absolutely. But I'm kind of thinking at the back of my mind, Roger Griffin, who would have said, it's not the same. It's not the same. Somebody is not fascist purely because they hate the Muslims or the Roma or the Chinese or whatever. I would say it's not the same, but they are relatives ideologically and emotionally. So very, very, very good question. I could go on forever, you know.
Thank you, Elżbieta. Other questions? Adam again. So please, Adam, your question.
Hi again. So at the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned the generic theory of fascism. And I would like you to ask you if you could elaborate a bit more on the criticism of the generic theory, if you could. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Well, I mean, I'm not the best person because I am a genericist myself, but I'm kind of trying to say that it's not just that. Generally speaking, generic fascism postulates that fascism has got a number of core distinctive ideas that separate it from other right-wing nationalist ideologies. So Roger Griffin's, for example, definition in that respect is this rebirth, ultra-nationalism, love for the community, but this notion of kind of reborn, kind of turning the page, coming up, rising from the ashes and everything, the populist side of it and so on and so forth. So, you know, we identified, well, people, genericists from the 1980s onwards in particular, and earlier, but identified a number of core characteristics. The criticism of generic fascism comes from different people for different reasons. Some people say simply every fascist movement and regime is so different that is unique. So you can't really compare them. They're too different. Okay, so that's the easy thing to say. They're too different to be seen as part of the same family. Okay, that's one thing. The more subtle criticism is, what does the ideology of fascism tell me, as a historian, about understanding historical phenomena? Okay, studying ideology, I know the idea. So, okay, yeah, that's great. I know what fascism means. But how the history of fascist movements and regimes happens in different countries is very different, is very dynamic, is very unpredictable, change all the time and everything. Plus, there is the other criticism, which is, and as I said, that's partly my frustration as well. So in some respects, I'm critical, but only in some respects. Historians of fascism, not so much these days, thankfully, but in the past, used to quarrel, write articles, books and everything, and saying, that's not fascist. That is fascist. That is not fascist. You can't put that in the discussion. So they used, Roger Griffin is not part of them, but a lot of historians used a very static view of fascist ideology and took it and then said, okay, let me now apply to all the case studies and see this one, it fits, yep, fascist, tick. This one, no, it's very different. You know, this is not A, B, C, or D. No, it's not fascist. This one, oh, I don't know, it's fascist. So we had all these groups of regimes and movements that we didn't know exactly how to classify. So take the example of the Franco in Spain, okay? Franco. Was Franco a fascist? Not really. I mean, he, as a person, he was a military general, so on and so forth, nationalist, Catholic, conservative, blah, 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 okay? But of course, he learns of what's happening at the time, and he gets like this. So is the regime that he sets up fascist? Well, if you were going back to the 1990s or 1980s, you would have this whole discussion. No, it isn't. It's authoritarian. Yes, it is. It's fascist. And essentially, a lot of critics of generic fascism were saying, have we defined fascism so strictly that we have made it almost unusable in everyday life? So that kind of understanding of fascist ideology is so fixed that I can't apply it to historical phenomena. And I end up with these situations where something ticks a few boxes but doesn't tick the other ones and so on. And that, to me, that's why for me Roger Griffin's approach is the most flexible, because he says, yes, these are the definitional elements, these are important, but they manifest themselves differently in different countries. So he tried to make that idea of generic fascism far less rigid. But the main criticism was that generic fascism assumes that fascism is A, B, C, and D, and it has to be A, B, C, and D in every single country throughout history, and so on and so forth. And that was a problematic position. Don't forget something else, Adam. A lot of fascism scholars have been initially very unwilling to use the word fascism after 1945. Because to them, fascism was only something that happened in the interwar years. And we should have a good conversation about the meaning of that term in a contemporary setting. I think this is a very good discussion to have, but we cannot expect that fascism 80 years later would be very similar to what happened 80 years ago in different countries and so on and so forth. So I don't know, you may be aware, it's not even Europe anymore. We talk about fascism in different parts of the world. We talk about India, for example. I have colleagues in my university who discuss India and talk about Indian fascism. And I'm like, that's an interesting term. This is not a country that I would normally associate. But of course, you look at the ideology and you find quite a lot of interesting similarities and a lot of differences. Okay, And that's fine, because we need to be aware of all the similarities and differences. This is why we're studying it historically. I don't know whether I tried to explain, I explained it enough.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for the question as well.
Okay, thank you. Who's next? Your questions, please. Okay, we'll wait for a while to collect some more questions. I'm going to use this time again to ask you what came up to my mind. You are also a historian of architecture and of urban space. You wrote the book called Third Rome. So one question regarding this, in your lecture, you mentioned national coffined approaches at the beginning or in the middle of your lecture. And one question regarding this to a related topic to mobility of anti-fascist ideas. I'm going to be long, so sorry for that, but one of my personal experience. First time when I was in Rome as a sport fan, I wanted to see Foro Italico and Stadio Olimpico. It was in 2012, as far as I remember. And at that time, I was a student and I didn't specialize in fascist studies. I knew the basic facts. And I was very surprised when I saw erected monument dedicated to Benito Mussolini directly in front of the Stadio Olimpico, in front of this complex. And I thought that it's just kind of rarity. Then I entered the gates of the Stadio Olimpico, and I was really surprised that it's not a rarity. It's something strange. On the floor at the Stadio Olimpico, there are kind of mosaics created by the Balilla, by the Italian youth fascist movement, dedicated also to Mussolini. And after my visit to Rome, I had the opportunity to visit other Italian towns as well, and I came to a conclusion that it's very common in Italy to see, even in the 21st century, the memorabilia, the monument, the statues, the fasces on the street lamps related to the fascist era of Mussolini. And contrary to that, when I was working on my PhD years ago, I did the research in Bundesarchiv and in Politisches Archiv des Auswärtigen Amtes in Berlin. And I was walking through the streets of Berlin and wanted to take some photos, some pictures of memorabilia and statues or some places related to history of the Third Reich. After a long 3 or 4 hours walk across Berlin, I came to a conclusion that almost all of them are vanished simply. They're not there anymore. So my question, why is it so? What does it say about the transnational framework of anti-fascist ideas? Aristotle, we can hear you. Okay.
Of course. Thank you very much for the question. Can I share my screen just for 2 photos? Okay. Hopefully it won't be too difficult, but this is what you're talking about. I've spent quite a lot of time there when I was researching my book. I mean, not only is this thing there, not only is an obelisk, but nobody has even bothered to at least try and erase the name Okay, so it's still there, and I mean, as you say, there are these beautiful mosaics which say duce, 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 and all those kind of things, and also they mark important events in the history of Italy, and of course Mussolini coming to power, the invasion of Ethiopia in 1936, the proclamation of the Impero is the empire are all there. But I just wanted to share one more thing because of what you said, and it is, hopefully I'll be able to share it. It's this. Now this is across where I live in Padova, and it's a university building. Now I'm a lover of this architecture, which is modernist architecture. It's not fascist architecture per se. So I kind of went around and started taking photos or whatever. And then I noticed this. Now this is the logo of the fascist party, and it became a standard inscription on pretty much every single building of that era. So it's the three fasci, the three bundles that represent this. I mean, nobody has bothered to even change it in many ways. So this is just across the street from where I live. That's why I always found it very interesting what you just said. Is there or should there be a history of mobilities of anti-fascism? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, take as a template the Spanish Civil War, which to me is one of those historical examples of the clash between the two mobilities. When you have physical mobilities, when you have a division whereby countries of a particular emerging bloc come together to fight for a cause, and countries of another bloc, but more importantly, anti-fascists from all over Europe travel to fight for that cause, quite like the idea of fascism, the ideas of fascism spread into inverted commas in the 1920s and 30s. The ideas of opposing this new political force spread as well. And let me say something here. The first people who used the word fascism in a generic sense of the word as something that goes beyond Italy are the socialists of the Socialist International. It was the first definition in the 1920s, shortly after Mussolini coming to power, when the definition comes up and says, this is not an Italian thing, this is an international thing. Okay, now we may disagree with the definition because it was rooted in Marxism or not, you know, there are Marxist historians today, but that's not the point. The point is that it was the opponents of fascism that first saw it as an international and transnational force. And then in the 1930s, you have the Popular Fronts, for example, which is almost like a force of anti-fascism. And that, of course, is a discussion that can be applied to a contemporary setting as well. You have an anti-fascist movement. It identifies itself as an anti-fascist movement. It is a transnational political force, very much a transnational political force. And yes, there is a history of mobilities there. In fact, Professor Nigel Copsey is very much talking about this, because when he's addressing conferences of fascism, he always keeps saying, come on, people, it's not just fascism, there is also anti-fascism. It's not just the diffusion of fascism, there is a diffusion of anti-fascism. So I think both discussions are actually very rich. And in some respect, you could say that the history of the mobilities of anti-fascism are even more dynamic, even more widespread. So I would say absolutely, yes, we need to have that discussion as well. And I hope the mobility in fascism, the mobility paradigm in fascism studies can actually draw attention to this as well, how the notion of opposing fascism, not only within a country, but actually going across borders, and the idea traveling from one country to the other and creating those alliances, I hope it will continue to animate approaches to the study of anti-fascism.
Thank you. Okay, we can take one or two more questions. If anyone interested, please raise your hand. Well, okay, it seems that no one is raising his hand. So therefore, Aristotle, thank you very much for your lecture, for your time, and for the discussion. And
before you say goodbye, Anton, can I just say one thing, because I'm talking to an audience mostly in Slovakia. I knew nothing about so-called Slovak fascism or not. And I was doing research in the archives of Bundesarchiv about a different project. So I found, obviously a lot of the documentation is missing about certain things. But as I was going through, just underneath the folder I was interested in, there was this huge file on Slovakia. I mean, literally, it was about 20 centimeters deep. So I thought, Slovakia? Why Slovakia? And basically, the whole archive, for some reason, while for other countries has disappeared, for Slovakia is there. So I started going through, and I was reading and reading and reading, and in the end, I included a short section in my book on fascism and genocide, talking about the codex and so on and so forth, and the deportation of Jews and everything. But what's interesting is I was talking to a colleague of mine in the UK who works in the UK, but he's Slovak originally. And back then, and I was saying, you know what, very interesting case study, and so on and so forth. And I used the word Slovak fascism, and he was like, you can't use that word in Slovakia. It was a terrible regime, but it's not fascist. And it's kind of part of that reaction, because same things I had when I was growing up in Greece, but this sort of idea that that's not fascist, because I checked the list and I didn't tick all the boxes, therefore it's not fascist, and so on and so forth. How, I'm thinking now, I didn't think at the time, how impoverishing is this attitude, which doesn't allow me to understand, yes, maybe don't want to call it fascist, that's absolutely fine. But this Slovak thing, whatever you decide to call it, or this Greek thing, did not emerge in a bowl of its own. It was interacting, it was learning, maybe it was rejecting at the same time. So it is this history of fascism, which is a bit messy. It's kind of crossing boundaries. Sometimes it doesn't go very far in everything, that I would like to urge you all to keep in mind that fascism is messy. The history of fascism is messy. The spread of fascist ideas is messy. But that means that we should study it, and we should understand that it is messy, and all the better for it. We have a very interesting subject of discussion. Anyway, I shut up here.
Thank you very much. Good news is that we've just prepared the first ever comparative monograph with my colleagues focusing on Slovak fascism, which is out in its Slovak version in May or June 2021, when the bookstores reopen. And then I'm preparing also a translated English version, which should be published by the CEU probably next year, sometime in summer 2022. So
I'm so looking forward to it, and also not least because we have individual scholars in different traditions working on different movements and comparative international. We have to completely demolish and bury once and for all the idea of peripheral fascisms. There's no such thing. Okay, they're probably slightly more successful electorally fascisms than other, and so on and so forth. But the idea that these are all peripheral and somehow, you know, we tuck them at the end of a chapter and it's fine, we tick the list, it's not there. So I look forward to it. Not in Slovak, I'm afraid. I will have to wait for a little bit more of a translation. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.